Welcome to the Directors Dialogue, our conversations with visionaries, leaders of science, education, medicine, and healthcare. Our guests share their most meaningful experiences and observations. They tell us what excites and concerns them about biomedical science today. And they offer also an inside perspective on emerging opportunities and challenges. Today is a really special event because it's incredible to think about it, because this is the first in-person event we're having since March 2020. So I think this is really a new era, and it is actually a new era because we're also doing this for the first time. Not just live with a live audience, but we're also having people being able to participate online, and so that's a first. And so I think that's perhaps something where we can say that's one of the good things that came out of the pandemic. We invite all of you at the end of the session to ask questions, and you have gotten cards, I think, where you could write those questions on for the audience here. And for those who view online, there's a question and answering box, and you can just put your questions into that box. And so we will kind of try to answer as many questions as we can. And I want to tell you a little bit about the Directors Dialogue series. We have been doing this now for over 2 years, and we have, from time to time, we have leaders talk to us, and the most recent were, for example, the we heard about nanoscale biotechnology from Bob Langer, and then we also heard from Wellesley's College President Paula Johnson talking about opportunities for women to thrive as scientists and leaders. And tonight we sort of focus on a different topic, and that is how to foster broad scientific literacy in American society. And we welcome Carl Zimmer for that. Thank you so much for joining us. Carl Zimmer is is a writer for the New York Times, and he's an author of 14 award-winning books about science. His books address all kinds of topics of science, from heredity, evolution, human brain, to bacteria, viruses, and parasites. And his latest book is Life's Edge, The Search of What It Means to Be Alive. Among many honors for his work, Carl is a 3-time winner of the American Association for the Advancement of Science Journalism Award, and he received the Distinguished Service Award from the National Association of Biology Teachers. But reporting and writing is probably not enough for you to fill your days, because Carl also teaches at Yale University, where he's an adjunct professor of molecular biophysics and biochemistry and a lecturer in English. Carl, welcome you so much for coming here today and sort of starting this in-person conversation.
Glad to be here.
So let's start, talking about you. How did you become a writer covering life sciences?
Well, I guess the writing came first, just in the sense that I was writing as long as I can remember, just little stories, and I don't know, and working for my high school newspaper. In college, I was an English major, but I was taking science classes because I found it interesting, but I didn't really put those two things together. It really wasn't until a couple years out of college where I got a job as an assistant copy editor at a magazine about science, at Discover Magazine. And after a while, they would let me do some fact-checking, and then they let me do a little writing and a little more writing and some editing. And, I just really kind of realized that this was something that I really enjoyed and I could really just plunge into. And so I was there for 10 years before I moved on and started writing books and writing for a number of outlets like National Geographic. And, the New York Times has sort of like become the main thing that I do aside from my books since then.
Yeah. So I was wondering, when you write a column for the New York Times, is how do you decide what to write about? There's so much science out there. So do you look at, what's going on, what excites you, what are your questions? Do you use analytics to figure out what's really trending? So how do you decide on that?
I try to stay away from the analytics. I try to just trust my own gut, like in the sense of, is this well, I suppose like whenever I'm talking about this stuff, I have to talk about the pandemic or the before times. So in the before times, I was really very much encouraged to write basic biology columns and so, which was great. It was very liberating, writing about plants, animals, Neanderthals, extraterrestrials, whatever, just life. And that's the wonderful thing about life, is that its diversity and its complexity. It's just continually surprising me in all sorts of ways. So, but you can't write about all the science. You just can't. And it's a little questionable to me, like trying to play the sort of like ranking game, like, oh, this is the most important thing to write about this week, like based on what, so I try to sort of, to recognize the serious advances, but then also to kind of like look for some of the strange corners, like here, there are some people who study this particular fish, and this particular fish is very weird and very interesting. I'm going to tell you about this fish and its strange, sexual reproduction habits. In that sense, I'm trying to like find things that are going to give me that sense of surprise, and then also kind of give readers that as well. But that was before COVID.
Since COVID, it's only COVID.
Well, I mean, it's been about 3 years. I remember, January, very early January, there was a virologist on Twitter I follow who was like, there's a pneumonia in China, and it looks like it might be a coronavirus. And I thought, I don't like those words together. Coronavirus, China, pneumonia, like we've been here before. I don't like this. But it was sort of hard to tell, was it going to be sort of relatively, was it going to be like SARS, where just like 800 people died, and which was terrible, but it's like it was contained and it's ended. Like you can't find SARS out in the wild. It's kind of amazing. Unfortunately, this was SARS with, asymptomatic spread, and, by February, my editor said, who had been my editor for things like Neanderthals and global warming and extraterrestrials, said, I'm just editing about COVID from now on. And I said, okay, do you need me to write about COVID? And he's like, yes, please. And so I didn't realize it, but for the next 2.5 years, it was just COVID, just one virus, it was exhausting. And the science team, we really kind of had to turn into, or as best we could, a kind of a breaking news team, a daily news, like filing sometimes a couple stories a day because so much was happening on every different front. And, you would and things that you just could not anticipate, like, because I would talk to evolutionary virologists and be like, okay, this virus, it's mutating, so what should we expect? This is like early 2020, and they're like, well, if it's acting like coronaviruses we know about, and if we're looking at flu also as a model, there's going to be kind of a steady mutation. It's not really going to be something we have to worry about too much. A couple years down the line, we might need to think about that in terms of a vaccine. And then just a few months later, this thing comes out of England, this variant, which we now call Alpha, which has, over a dozen mutations all at once. And I go back to these people, I'm like, you told me this was not going to happen. And they're like, I know, I don't, and then there was Delta, and then Omicron, and just, this thing is evolving in a deeply surprising way. So yeah, that's been a feature of it too.
That's also sort of, there's the question of that science was changing. How did you adapt to the science, and how was it possible to, do you think it is possible actually to explain that changing science?
I mean, I think in all of the stuff that I've written in my career, I've tried to reflect how scientists do science, how scientists know what they know, and then, how it turns out that maybe things turned out differently. Like, that's the scientific process. I mean, it's no surprise that scientists come up with a hypothesis, seems pretty good. 10 years later, you look back and you're like, did we really think that? And that's how it works. But in the pandemic, this was happening in overdrive. There are these ideas about the virus, and then those ideas turn out to be wrong, and the whole world is looking, and public health policy is being built on it. There was a time when you were probably all wiping down your groceries. And that was based on certain ideas about, transmission by fomites and so on. And then it turned out, probably that didn't matter so much. We need to think about this virus differently as something in the air. And so I was trying in my writing to reflect that in all these different areas. But it's challenging, and you can see how that change for a lot of people that is an opportunity, that can be an opportunity for a lot of feeling of distrust or not knowing what to think, that somehow scientists just tell you how it is and then are not allowed to change.
Yeah. Let's turn to your book, which you must have been writing during the pandemic.
I started before the pandemic, and I took this. I had a few trips planned out, but I was like, there's a pandemic closing in. I think I'm not going to be flying. This was in February 2020. I was telling people, like, I'm not going to be flying, and they're like, really? Like, really? You think it's going to be really? I'm like, we're not going to. Yeah, don't cancel your plans for your June vacation. Like, and they thought I was crazy. But I still, there was, I wanted, for this book about life, I was writing about hallmarks of life. And one of that hallmarks is homeostasis. And I was just so fascinated by bats and how bats can adjust their homeostasis when they're hibernating and coming out of it, and how they're dealing with white nose syndrome, which disrupts their homeostasis. And so these bat biologists in the Adirondacks were like, yeah, come with us. We're going to go into an abandoned mine at the end of February and do a bat survey. And I was like, all right, just one more trip, And I was just so nervous about, I was very nervous about the virus. Of course, I was going into this abandoned graphite mine where, you could very easily get killed, but somehow that seemed less important than the virus. I don't know. I had weird priorities. But anyway, yeah. So once the pandemic came, I was like, okay, I'm going to wrap this book up now. And but it was a nice diversion from the daily craziness of COVID to just talk with philosophers and physicists and so on about, well, what do we mean when we talk about life?
When I was reading the book, I sort of noticed sort of a certain style where I thought it was sort of trying to be persuasive, where you tried to convince your reader with facts. But do you think that actually works? And specifically, like in the first chapter where you talk a lot about abortion, do you think that actually works and helps people to grasp that maybe it's not such a great idea to actually talk about the beginning of life?
Right. Well, so in that chapter, I sort of talk about our particular situation in the United States with these debates about abortion and when quote unquote life begins. And in a way, what I'm trying to do with the facts of developmental biology is to just make people question their own assumptions. Like, wait, am I thinking about this? I thought that the way I thought fit with the facts. And so maybe I need to come up with a new image. But I don't want to do, my approach there was not to be like, say to the reader, you're an idiot, let me explain why. Like, that's not what I'm trying to do. But I'm, when people make claims, very prominent political claims that are in fact not backed up by the facts, then I will point that out and explain why. But, you have to be careful with how you deploy facts. Like just burying people in bits of data, just all that does is drown them. I mean, you're not, if you have a goal that you have for using those facts, you need to think about what that goal is and actually think about how you present those facts. And there's a whole world of rhetoric, of storytelling, and so on that is very useful for crafting how you present those things.
Yeah, I mean, let's follow up on misinformation about science. That has certainly is affecting ability to deal with the pandemic and also with climate change. And so sometimes, the misinformation is clearly deliberate, politically or financially motivated. But there could also be that there's just a general lack of the public to understand science, understand enough science. And so, like if we take climate change, what do you think is the sort of fundamental points of confusion and how to address that and bring it, kind of open that dialogue that you were just talking about?
Right. Well, I mean, compared to sort of misinformation about COVID, misinformation about climate change is pretty, it's been around for a long time. I mean, and certainly I remember in the 90s when I was starting to, learning to be a science writer, and I was writing about climate change, but there wasn't this sort of misinformation industry set up yet. And so we would just be writing about the science of it, and it didn't seem like a lot of people knew what global warming was or cared, but we were just trying to write about the science as it was emerging. But then you started to see like a very concerted campaign playing on, sort of people's things that, putting out things that sound science-y or truthy, but in fact were misrepresenting science. And so, that's how you can have, a U.S. senator show up, in the Senate with a snowball and say like, oh, it's cold here in Washington, D.C., therefore no global warming. Yeah. I mean, that happened quite a while ago, but that sort of thing continues to happen. Like every time it's cold, someone says like, well, no global warming, right? That plays on, maybe people are just thinking about, well, getting confused with the noise and the trend. That's a basic thing. I think that's the sort of thing that you want, rather than trying to debunk these things, some people refer to pre-bunking them. I think of that as maybe just, high school science class. I mean, like, that, to me, that really has to be where the focus is. And that just needs all the support it can get.
Yeah, so, I mean, pre-bunking, so do you think we can learn something from the pandemic to kind of
Sure.
Plan for the next one and the communication about it?
Well, you could have, I mean, I think a lot of, certainly a lot of us who had been writing about viruses and vaccines before kind of knew what was going to happen to some extent. Like we knew that there were going to, there was a group that was, opposed to a lot of vaccines. They would claim that vaccines caused autism. I mean, that had been going on since the early 2000s. And they had a playbook. It's kind of similar in some ways to the, climate denial playbook. Mm-hmm. And they were ready to use it. And they had lots of opportunities to use it that didn't exist in the early 2000s, like Instagram and TikTok and Facebook. And they worked really hard at it. I don't think the scientific community or the public health system really was was up for it, up for that challenge. It just, I don't think they really have done a great job.
So is there actually communication between like the New York Times and public health in terms of how they're communicating?
Well, we're journalists, so we're not going to be, cozy with the government. We're not going to, we don't, I mean, we write about things and we don't necessarily say nice things. So, we certainly will reach out for information from the CDC or what have you. But we really say okay, what can we do to, in our mission to give information to our readers? And so that can take a lot of different forms. So, it turned out that the US government was doing a pretty terrible job of just tracking how many cases of COVID there was. And so a lot of different places, including the New York Times, said, all right, let's just try to do it ourselves. It's like you can't really coordinate with somebody who's not doing what you'd think that the government ought to be doing, but they weren't doing it. So places like the New York Times did it, and but there can also be other things. Like I worked a lot with a graphics designer named Jonathan Coram, and we sort of said maybe we need to just start at the basics, what does a virus do? Let's remind people about this. And then with podcasts. So the New York Times has a podcast called The Daily, and Michael Barbaro, I've been on a couple times, he's like, okay, here's what we're gonna do for the next one. We have gone to a bunch of 6-year-olds, and we have asked them to ask us questions about the pandemic. And now you are going to answer them, live. We're going to play them to you, and you're going to answer them, and that'll be our podcast episode. And it was terrifying. They were awesome questions, and I needed to answer them clearly and honestly for a 6-year-old. But I realized what the podcast producer's strategy was. It's they're the kids, and behind them are the parents who have all the same questions, but want to pretend that they're grown up and not scared and know everything that's going on, but they didn't. So we just sort of all right, we're going to just start at the basics with this thing.
Oh, that's great. That's actually goes well to the next question I would like to ask you, which is really sort of turning around the advice that you can give us in terms of scientists, how we could communicate our science better. And whether institutions, how can we train our scientists, our trainees, to be better in communicating?
Well, I teach a science writing, science communication workshop at Yale, just a short thing, but I've done it for, I don't know, over 10 years or something like that. And I stress there that you really need to think. You need to think about who you're talking to. You're not just putting out data. You're not just putting out facts. You're not just putting out words. You're talking to someone. You're writing a story for someone. Who is that person? What are their concerns? What do they know? What do they not know that you know? And again, it's not even there's somebody across a table that you're talking about. You're talking about potential readers. So it's a challenge, and it's not something that just sort of happens overnight. It's like learning how to do statistics. You learn how to communicate, how to write. You have to wean yourself from the passive voice. It's things like that, which can be challenging for scientists to do.
And so can you give some tips of how scientists can deal with misinformation?
With misinformation? There's a whole kind of growing sort of field of the science of misinformation, which is quite interesting. So David Rand here at MIT and lots of other people are actually trying to understand how misinformation spreads. Why it can spread so much faster than factual information, and what are the dynamics of that? And so you can approach it as a scientist. I mean, and so I would encourage people to kind of get familiar with this existing field of research, and it's not, and you have to remember, like, misinformation is not simply like, oh, people just don't have the right information. Like, if you have certain, political commitments, or you self-identify in certain ways, the more you know about science overall, the more likely you might be to, like, have a factually incorrect view of something like global warming. So it's not that people just don't understand science. It's deeper than that.
Do you think there's certain organizations or centers that do a particular good job in science education? Sort of educating communicators in science?
With communication. There are some places that are working on that. So Stony Brook University actually.
Alan Alda, right, yeah.
Yeah, Alan Alda has a whole center there that just focuses on that. And, it's really, but the thing is, like, well, does everybody, like, does that mean that all scientists, in training have to go to Stony Brook? It might be that maybe that becomes more a part of how scientists are trained, sort of across the board, that there's a reward structure in place. A lot of, there are a lot of people, there are some scientists, epidemiologists who have been, working really hard during the pandemic trying to provide clarity. They have Substacks and what have you, and they've been, doing a good job of it, but they just are kind of doing it like extra, like on the side. Like there's nothing in the scientific community that sort of builds that in as a reward structure.
So you think one should provide something, so this should be part of the training and then part of the expectations?
You can't just expect to wake up one morning and be, like, really good at doing this stuff. I mean, that would be unrealistic. And on top of that, like, graduate students in science are just, they're working like crazy, learning all the things that they have to learn in order to do all these experiments, to publish all these papers, like, just to get their career going. So when could there possibly be time in all of that to deal with these very important issues?
But it has to come. It has to happen at some point, right? Yeah. So how, on the other hand, how can the public, how do you think the public, where do they get their information? How can they actually get their science information? Reading the New York Times?
Yes, of course. Everyone needs to read it. Please subscribe now. I think that, in addition to the importance of science education in the grade school, in high school, there really needs to be a real focus on sort of digital news literacy. Like, where do you get your information from, and how do you evaluate it? Like, just that process. You can't, because, like, when I went to high school, like, we didn't have a class like that. It was because there were newspapers and there were books and there were, like, 2 news shows, and that was about it. That's how old I am. But, now it's like people need to be equipped to deal with this flood of stuff, a lot of which is garbage, and how do you manage that? So there are some movements on that front. So Carl Bergstrom at University of Washington has been doing a lot of stuff about digital news literacy, particularly with science. But I think what he's doing is great, but it's really, it is focused very much on the college level. He's been trying to work it down to, like, special events for high school, but I think it needs to be at the high school level because, if you're talking about, the citizenry of this country, like, the majority of people don't go to college, and if they do go to college, they're not taking a whole bunch of science classes. So it's unrealistic to say, like, oh, like in some upper level science class, we'll finally get to these issues.
But how? Yeah, but how can you then get any kind of help with misinformation, right? Because if people don't learn it in school, if they don't have the techniques available.
Right, but yes, but but there are movement. The people are working on this. That's so there is reason for
Maybe we should start with
optimism.
the 6-year-olds, right?
Sure, absolutely. No, I mean I remember our kids are in college now, but I do remember when they went to a perfectly nice school and the teachers were very good, but in I guess 3rd or 4th grade, they were starting to teach them about research, and for them it was just going online, and it occurred to me as they would ask me about things that they were reading online, I'm like, oh, they're kids, and they assume that anything on the internet is true because some grown-up wrote it. It's, I can see that thinking when you're 8, but that's when you need to start saying well, actually, just because someone can put it online doesn't make it true. So yeah, so it does. The earlier, the better. I mean, it's sort of like saying well, when should we teach people how to spell? It's maybe before high school.
Yeah. How did you get into science?
How to get into science?
Yeah, the interest in science. Yeah, was there a specific mentor or?
No. No.
Because you were English, right?
I was an English major, yeah, but I don't know. It was just always something. I mean, maybe I'll credit Carl Sagan. Maybe I don't know. I really liked Cosmos. I really enjoyed that. So maybe that was what did it.
Interesting. Maybe we can get some questions from the audience now. We have hands. Okay. Maybe we'll go. You have to speak up. And
I think there's a microphone there.
We had the cards, but maybe we have a microphone. Oh, okay. Maybe if you can speak up, yeah. Why don't you stand up?
Hello. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us. And also, I really appreciate your candidness. So when we talk about science literacy, that involves seeking out information to receive the literacy that we're talking about to be more informed and making your own health decisions even. In my experience, when talking to those expressing science denialism, it seems to be rooted in a lot of distrust. So distrust in scientific institutions, which includes the scientists within those institutions. So what responsibility does every individual in this building, in the Whitehead Institute, have in building that trust? And building that trust among individuals that historically have a very rational and logical reason to be distrustful in these scientific institutions.
So the question was about distrust for scientists and scientific institutions and how scientists can address that. I guess just looking historically at how scientists have reckoned with these sorts of things, I think there have been scientific organizations that have acknowledged the sources of those distrusts, but in some cases it's a long time coming. So I believe the American Society for Human Genetics is just starting to acknowledge being involved with eugenics. That's just this year. Just they're and we're talking about things that have been clear for decades. So it's never too late to reckon with those sources of distrust. But on the other hand, we do have a problem where for a substantial number of people, and anything that scientists say that doesn't fit into a particular story is going to be taken as false, and that is a big problem. That is sort of like a Dan Kahan at Yale refers to this as a kind of I'm going to mess up his words. He kind of refers to it as sort of like a, pollution of the sort of science communication water supply. That, like, what do you, the main thing is you don't want to get pollution into your water table, because then it's really hard to get it out. It takes a long time for that. And so, I think, I'm not going to, I'm a journalist. I'm not going to be giving you like a list of things that you have to do, but I would say that, on the one hand, acknowledge those sources of distrust. That is an important thing that has been going on, but also, to then kind of, look at, well, where are those sources of distrust being generated now? And it's not necessarily from the scientific community, but it's, the platforms that, the way platforms are engineered, for example.
David, you had a question, right?
Yeah, it was a wonderful discussion at this point. You talked about the disappearance of a broad coverage of science with the appearance of COVID. So my question is, do you see light at the end of the tunnel? Is there evidence of post-COVID science writing?
Yeah. Sorry, the question is there evidence of post-COVID science writing? Yes, I'm happy to report. Yeah. So I would say. So I just gave you an example. There was some researchers who went to Greenland and they pulled out some permafrost samples and basically have gotten so good at getting ancient DNA out of that stuff that they were able to reconstruct an ecosystem from 3 million years ago, full of mammoths and all sorts of strange creatures, a very lush, rich forest ecosystem. And it was great fun to write about because it was not COVID. And a lot of people read it. I mean, when we looked at the analytics, we're like, wow, a lot of people are really enjoying this. And I'm sure that part of that was, well, it's just a cool story. It's an important story because it's by far the oldest ancient DNA ever found. But I think my feeling is like people will be like, science can also have this, have this capacity to like just kind of open your eyes to these surprises in the world. So that does feel good. Of course, I think literally like the next article I wrote was about the next COVID variant. So I think for the time being, I'm kind of 50-50, and that's partly for my own sanity, but also, the pace of COVID news has changed in the sense like it's more familiar to us. Probably a lot of us have had COVID now, but it still remains I would argue it still remains along with climate change the most pressing, urgent science news story right now. So there will be more COVID in the future. COVID news.
We have an online question, Erin.
Yes, one of the members of the online audience asks, Carl, when you consider a story, say on the genetics of the coronavirus, how do you pick the tone or the level of the language you'll use?
Yeah, so the level of language, well, I guess sort of as a general principle, I try to think about how little jargon I can get away with, because jargon is just very problematic, and there are lots of different ways that you can just avoid using jargon and still be accurate, because every time you use jargon, you have to introduce it. You slow down your story or your explanation or what have you, and you certainly can't just use jargon and assume people know what you mean. So, in terms of the kind of tone I'm using, I mean, I would like, a reasonably motivated high school student to get what I'm writing. I'm not really writing for you. I'm writing for as broad an audience as I can, kids in high school included, if possible.
We have a real follow-up question from a real teacher.
Oh,
As a
great.
teacher of who's in our audience, as a teacher of biology high school, what are the most important lessons that my students should leave with my class with? Yeah, this is not an easy one.
Yeah, I mean, I guess sometimes go and visit high school biology classes and kind of leave, kind of exhausted and impressed, and like, I really don't want to be the one saying, "This is what you should do, you biology teachers." I would. I do think it's important and challenging. Hard. So it's very hard in the biology class to be talking to students about the way biology actually is now, because I think a lot of the lesson plans and so on were really established in maybe the 60s and the 70s, when biology was biologists thought about biology in a certain way, and things have moved on. I don't need to tell people at the Whitehead things are a little different now. And so, for example, it's great to talk about Mendel and his plants, but you don't want to stop there. You need to be able to convey to students how actually genes work together, and you have traits that are influenced by many genes, and if you just leave people with this sort of very simple Mendelian kind of view of biology, that can really wreak havoc when they then go and they look at, they're going to go to 23andMe and they're going to get genetic test results, and they're going to be like, oh my gosh, I'm going to die of cancer. That will happen if they're not. There needs to be a way to sort of to teach students about the biology of 2023, not the biology of 1953.
Yeah, here's another question from an educator, and that's sort of about more pre-bunking misinformation as an important and essential way to create a healthier society. But that's the long game. So what do we do now to work against weaponization of misinformation?
I think if you keep sort of putting off the long game never gets dealt with. So there are lots of the New York Times has lots of when things crop up, if there's some fake documentary claiming that people are dying suddenly of heart attacks from COVID vaccines, we or others like us, we will try to jump on those things and report them out and show why that's not actually the case. This documentary is actually showing stuff from before the pandemic and so on. We can deal with that small scale stuff. I think teachers should just keep focused on the long game. And I think there needs to be more thought about the long game.
Yeah. Erin?
So this is a statement asking whether or not you agree. There is evidence that the public trust individual scientists more than they trust scientific institutions, which I think argues for training all scientists to become proficient in science communications to non-scientists. Do you agree?
Or do you want to comment?
I don't think it's my place. I'm a journalist. Science. I'm not. I'm not your dad. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm a journalist, and so I'm writing about science. I can tell you about what my observations on these things. It is striking to me that actually scientists are, as individuals, it is true, do have a very high level of respect in this country, even now. The trends have not been great during the pandemic, honestly, but still, So if you look at these same surveys, if you look where journalists come out, you should not be asking me that, because we're down here. We're at the used car salesman level. So we have our own problems. So again, I hear what this person's saying, and I'm not really sure that I'm the person to be commenting on that.
Emily, you have to speak up and take your mask off.
Thank you very much. I'm curious from an editorial perspective, what counts as a science story? I'm thinking particularly of a story I read quite a few years ago in the New York Times describing fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and the dangers of reproductive during pregnancy, and it appeared in the style section, and presumably because it thought that the audience was pregnant women. And I'm wondering what the editorial decisions around what qualifies as, what I would think is an interesting story of developmental biology versus a story about lifestyle.
So the question was about the editorial decisions about what constitutes a science story, and giving an example of something that you're reading in the style section that seems about
Maybe we can make
science.
it even more pointed. Why does human health ends up in the style section?
Well, I mean, if you go to a magazine stand and go pick up lifestyle magazines, there'll be lots of ostensibly science stories in there about tips for your health and so on like that. I don't vouch for the quality of that reporting you may come across. I think, so the thing is that science is not in some sort of clean box. Science is not often a vacuum. Science is an activity that is done by people who are shaped by their politics, their social surroundings, their culture, and in turn influences the culture around it. So yes, like my column is in the science section because they decided they would have a bunch of science writers, but like honestly, like I feel like when I am writing, say, about ancient DNA of Native American tribes, I'm going to call up representatives of those tribes and talk to them about what this means for them. Is that science? No, but I think that's an important part of that story. And I think it's honest. I think it's great, like, if science stories are in all sorts of places, if people are getting hit by science, like, there's somebody who's going to, like, open up the Science Times section of the New York Times. It's kind of like, I kind of know, I've already got those people in the bag, But somebody who might be like, oh, science, I don't want to read that. I'm going to open up the style section. Like, if there's a good story about something about science that's somehow relevant, it fits in there, great. That's great. I mean, I think there should be science stories everywhere. And certainly through the pandemic, that has been the case. We've been collaborating with political writers, and it's been amazing collaborating with non-science writers. So anyway, I guess that's my point. It's like science is not in a box.
So many questions. Why don't you go?
Yeah. Thanks so much for being here, Carl. Since there's so many degrees of certitude in science, and since there's so many agendas, and particularly some of the greatest communicators are market-driven communicators with for-profit agendas, and yet some of the greatest science is coming out of that too. What's the process you and your editors use to try to sort through these different agendas? I'm not talking about pseudoscience, but real science, and try to make sense of it and find a path through it.
Yeah, I mean that is a challenge. I mean, how to deal with science, how to deal with agendas that people have, I think that was especially important, again, to bring it back to the pandemic. It was very important in the pandemic because, we would be writing about vaccine development, and then, Pfizer would let us know, like, hey, we have results. And we'd be like, okay, so how much do we get to see? There was definitely a problem. There was a real challenge of science by press release from vaccine makers. They would put out, they would just say like, oh, things look great. Later you might get some stuff, might be able to look at a slide deck and be like, oh, it's maybe not quite, there's stuff under the hood that, it would have been good to know about earlier. It's hard, and I think that, certainly when you're looking at science from, I think part of what you do is you try as best you can to kind of like have a sort of, reach out to people for a variety, experts for a variety of perspectives on information, so that people will, someone may point out like, I think they're jumping ahead of their data, and you can tell why they're doing that, just to get this range of views, not just to be a stenographer for a company.
Maybe we should get another online, because also you will have a chance to ask questions, obviously, at the reception. So.
This question asks, for the last several years, scientists have been asked to make their research accessible and digestible via short tweets or videos. How can scientists stay true with such, this is a quote, reductive translations?
I'm sorry, scientists have been what was the verb there?
Sure, have been asked to make their research accessible and digestible.
This is why I don't like the passive voice. Who is doing the asking? I would like to ask this person. I don't know. I mean, have you, in the audience, have you been asked to do? Yes. Yeah, so some people are saying yes, someone's saying no. Okay. I think anyone who tells you, like, you need to get on Twitter to, like, explain, heterochromatin, like, come on. I mean, some people can do that. They can, like, a 20-tweet thread, like there are just some people, some scientists have proven themselves to be masters of this, like, kind of online haiku. I don't know how they do it. I really admire, like, and it's become a thing where it's like, it's almost like a convention now. I mean, it's a shame that Twitter is now what Twitter is now. But, maybe you can try it on Mastodon, but I don't, I think if you enjoy doing that stuff on social media, why not? Like, but the idea that, like, everyone has to do it just seems, I don't know, that seems impractical to me. And it's like, it's a bit like, again, I'm going to date myself. 15 years ago, blogging. Everybody had to blog. Everybody had to blog. Every boss was telling everyone below them, you have to have a blog. And, like, people hated it. And you could tell that they hated it when you would read these posts that they were writing with a gun to their head. So, these are opportunities. I think that's how people should think of it.
I want to end with one last question, which is very kind of personal, and that is, did you experience burnout as a science communicator these past few years? If so, how did you overcome it? If not, what keeps you engaged? And I think that probably reflects for a lot of people.
I did experience some burnout, and I think that's true across the board. My friend Ed Young, who's at the Atlantic, he won a Pulitzer for his magnificent work. He's taken 6 months off. He just has to spend some time not dealing with all this, and I completely respect that. And talking to other colleagues, like, it really was wearing. I think because the news was coming so fast, because it was so challenging, and because it could get to be a very toxic environment in which you were trying to keep up, and you're watching healthcare workers just falling apart, and millions of people with long COVID. I mean, this is a trauma. This is we can't deny this. Over 1 million of our fellow citizens are dead. This has been a horrible thing, and trying to bear witness to it can be a taxing thing. So yeah, I definitely needed, there were points where I just needed to kind of dial it down a bit or write about Greenland 3 million years ago or what have you. But I'm not I will be going forward trying to continue to write about COVID without burning out. We'll see.
So with that, I really want to thank you, and I have a little gift sort of to also recognize that this is a memorial event, and thank you very, very much. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And you all know that the Whitehead Institute is an extraordinary place, and I invite you to also take the time to learn a bit more about our work and what we're doing and the discoveries we're making, and we're trying to communicate them well to the public. Please go to our website and learn about our research. Sign up for Pulse, our monthly newsletter, and please consider to make a gift to the Whitehead Institute. And thank you all very, very much. So this will be sort of the end of the online, but I invite also everybody to come to the reception. And then there are so many more questions we cannot answer, so I'm sure there will be a lot of the interesting discussion following over some beverage. So thank you again. Thank you very, very much.